Welcome to Rose Hill Plantation State Historic Site. I'm Ranger Stephanie, and today we're going to talk a little about Juneteenth. This is the third segment of our Juneteenth videos, and we're going to talk a little about what happened after Juneteenth, after freedom came. Now, as you've heard, Juneteenth is celebrated because on June 19th, 1865, enslaved individuals in Galveston, Texas, finally learned that they were freed men, women, and children. This is the last known area in the former Confederate States to have learned, for enslaved individuals to have learned that they were free. This was over 2 months after the end of the Civil War. So over 2 months after, these individuals should have learned that they were free. Now, if we think about it, this is 2021. We're only 156 years out of the end of the Civil War and out of slavery. That's not that long ago. So it's important to remember Juneteenth and celebrate this end to slavery, this day of freedom in the United States. And as we talk about that, I want to mention that you may notice I'm surrounded by some big trees here. I'm standing in an old grove of hickory trees. Some of these hickory trees around me date back to the late 1700s, early 1800s. We call these old hickory trees witness trees. These trees have witnessed a lot of history pass by it. These trees have witnessed here at Rose Hill the plantation system with fields of cotton and corn surrounding them, slavery happening. Up to 178 people were enslaved at Rose Hill at once. They would have witnessed these people forced to labor in the fields and forced to do many things against their will. These trees would have witnessed the end of slavery, the Juneteenth that happened at Rose Hill, though we don't know what date it actually happened here at Rose Hill. These trees, along with emancipation, would witness tenant farmers and sharecroppers exercising their freedom, forging their life right here on this land surrounding it. These trees would have witnessed tenant farmers, their children, gathering hickory nuts right at the bases of these old trees. These trees would have seen the violence of the Klux Klan that happened in the Reconstruction Era, would have seen the effects of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment, giving freedom, citizenship, and due process to African Americans. These trees would have witnessed many things, from the Jim Crow laws taking effect to Rose Hill becoming a state park in 1960. These trees are witness trees and bear witness to the many things that we don't know for sure happened here. Now, as these trees witness many things, we want to talk a little about some of the things, as I mentioned, they could have witnessed. After Juneteenth, many people who were now freed African Americans, they left the area they used to be enslaved. Some went north, west, some wandered around the south in some areas looking for individuals they were ripped away from during slavery, loved ones that were lost. Here at Rose Hill, we know that some people chose to stay on. They stayed on by becoming tenant farmers and sharecroppers. They were free, but they stayed at Rose Hill or in nearby areas, and they farmed the same land or similar land that they used to farm when they were enslaved. In exchange for their labor, they received some meager compensation. This could be a little bit of money, room and board, various things. Sometimes it was just a share of the crop. And here at Rose Hill, we know just after Juneteenth, after the end of slavery, there were up to 66 people who formed tenant farmer contracts at Rose Hill with William Henry Gist, the plantation owner. These people would have lived here and try to forge their lives here as tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Now, how these individuals learned about their freedom just a few months prior, we're not sure. We don't know, as I mentioned, when the Juneteenth Freedom Day came to Rose Hill. But we know on nearby Mabinton Plantation, which is just a few miles over, and a county over in Newberry County, some individuals heard about freedom on their plantation. And I'm going to read a quote from Pick Gladney. This is from the WPA narratives, which are testimonies of former enslaved individuals that recount their time in slavery, the time during Reconstruction, their Freedom Day, various points of their lives. And Pick recounted the day he was free, his thoughts on the matter, and what happened. So Pick says, "I was old enough to go to the speech that Dan White made on Mabinton Day. We climbed trees so we could see and hear. I should have listened, but I don't remember nothing of what the man said. I know that I still hear the band music ringing in my ears. I was right there at Squire Hardy's that day freedom came and the band came to Mabonton. So Pick recalls that a man, Dan White, probably a federal soldier, came and announced on his plantation, on the plantation he used to be enslaved, that he was free, as were all African Americans enslaved there. They were now freed men, women, and children. Now, did that happen at Rose Hill? Did a federal officer come and announce to the up to 178 people that they were free? We don't know. We don't have records of that. So the people here may have actually heard that they were free at another plantation, or they may have heard it at the courthouse in downtown Union. From the WPA narratives, we do know that Charlie Meadows, when he was a boy, heard that he and his family were free at the courthouse in downtown Union. And after he recounts that he heard he was free, he also says, "Next day, we went to work as usual. His family all stayed on and gathered the crops." So he recounts that after he learned that he was free, he and his family went back to the plantation they were enslaved at, and they continued to harvest the crops, to pick the crops. This was actually somewhat typical in many areas. Many now freed African Americans were encouraged to go back to where they were enslaved and continue the harvest, so the crops didn't wither in the fields. After the harvest was continued, after the season was completed, then many of them left. But some, as I mentioned, stayed as tenant farmers and sharecroppers. We're entering the Reconstruction Era, which went from about 1865 to 1877, though in some areas Reconstruction ended early. Union County, it did end earlier. It ended potentially as early as 1871 rather than 1877. And here had at Rose Hill up to 178 people enslaved just before the end of the Civil War. These people were now freed men and women, and some of them we likely believe stayed on as tenant farmers and sharecroppers. There were 66 tenant farmers at Rose Hill right after the Civil War. Many of those people may have been enslaved here just a few months prior. And we happen to have a tenant farmer contract right here, and let me bring it up so you can see it. This is a labor contract, and it is between the plantation owner, William Henry Gist, and Vardy Gist, who was a tenant farmer, and several other tenant farmers. Vardy Gist was a blacksmith. He was a skilled person, so he was able to kind of strike a deal for some extra things here. We actually have here that Vardy, in addition to what all the tenant farmers in this contract get, he gets also an additional 125 pounds of lint cotton besides his share of the crop in exchange for his blacksmithing. And we can see, if I flip this over here, who signed the contract. We have William Henry Gist at top, then we have Vardy Gist, and underneath are the other tenant farmers. We have Levi Gist, Brock Gist, Sam Gist and wife, John Gist for, it looks like he signed for Jake, Nathan Gist, Eliza Gist, Violet Richards, and Amos Gist. So all these people, along with Vardy Gist, were tenant farmers. They were signing this contract for a season to labor here at Rose Hill. Now, tenant farmers, they had to kind of forge a life. They were trying to understand what freedom meant and make a life for themselves and many times for their families as well. And they faced a lot of adversity in doing this because they were still trying to figure out what freedom meant, and a lot of people were not happy with the fact that they were actually freed. So we have here also a very interesting thing. This is, let me bring it up here. This is a picture of the 1868 legislatures of South Carolina. So as far as tenant farmers, sharecroppers, they faced a lot of challenges, but there was also in Reconstruction a lot of forward movement. You had the 14th and 15th Amendment, which gave these individuals, these newly freed men and women, rights, citizenship, the right to own property, due process. voting rights, with the 15th Amendment, black men were given the right to vote. And with the right to vote meant they could vote for people who looked like them, who represented their ideals, their values. And that's what happened with this 1868 legislature. In addition to voting, you could run for office and you could represent people like yourself. We have here Junius Mobley. He's right here. He was from Union District. Junius became a House of Representative in 1868. He represented the people of his district in Union County. Later on, Junius ran for Senate. He actually ran against his former enslaver. Unfortunately, Junius did not win that race, but he was able to go against the person who actually, under the law, owned him just a few years before. That probably was very scary for the former enslaver, because suddenly Junius was exercising his rights. He was showing that he was a human being, a citizen. He was a person with thoughts, ideas, and the ability to represent people like him. So with all these new freedoms of Reconstruction, enslaved individuals, who are now freed men and women, remember, were able to really show who they were as people. But along with all this forward momentum, there was actually a lot of setback too, because a lot of people weren't happy with the changes that were occurring. This was the time when the Ku Klux Klan started to form. The Klan was very active in Union County. Actually, Rose Hill Plantation's former owner, William Henry Gist, two of his sons, Richard Gist and David Gist, were leaders in the Ku Klux Klan. They attempted to make it very difficult, at times impossible, for tenant farmers like Vardy Gist, who we talked about before, to exercise his rights. This was a time of a lot of fear. It was a time of lynchings. And along with all this, there was a lot of racial prejudice against people of color, and it was hard for these individuals who were newly freed to not just know what their rights were, but if they knew them, to exercise them. This was a time when it was legal to have literary tests in voting booths and poll taxes. Right after the Black Codes, as we phase out of Reconstruction, after the 1870s, we head into the Jim Crow era. The Jim Crow laws were legal segregation, legal disenfranchisement. This was legal racial laws. These were laws that made it legal to discriminate against people of color. And these continued on for decades. Decades and decades into the 20th century, and Reconstruction just kind of was cut short. It never really completed. Because of this, we're seeing echoes of it. Echoes of what could have been, all the way into modern day. As we're surrounded by these historic witness trees that have seen history take place, I hope you take time to reflect on this historic day, Juneteenth, on the past and a future filled with freedom.